The storm was not an ordinary tempest. The old one said it came as a living omen. First, the sky darkened to a strange purple. Then the wind shifted direction, and then the entire mountain seemed to hold its breath. During those days, no one ventured outside. Mothers closed their windows, the elderly reinforced their doors, and the guards doubled their watch, because the storm brought hunger, cold, and things no one dared to name. It was still on the horizon, but everyone already feared what was coming. It was late afternoon when Lyra left the market with empty hands and her stomach burning with hunger. She had days of weakness in her body, nothing but water and flour to fool life, and yet she stopped at the stall when she saw the piece of bread. A small gesture, an act of love. She took it to give to a feverish beggar, hunched on a bench, who desperately needed help. But her kindness was treated as a crime. "Thief!" they shouted.
Thief!
The word fell on her like mud and blood. They called her a worthless omega, dead weight, a disgrace to the clan. The humiliation was so brutal that even those who had once received her help fell silent. No one defended her. No one looked at her like a person. And when they cast her out of the village, it was as if they had torn from her the little ground she had left. Lyra walked toward the mountain with her soul wounded and the sky collapsing over her. Then she heard a low cry, wet, lost. Two twin wolf pups, nestled in the mud, seeking shelter at the edge of the storm. They looked lost and waiting for someone to find them. Lyra gathered them under her coat, climbed the trail against the wind, and sheltered them in a cave while the night raged outside. Between thunder and cold, she sang to keep the three of them alive. And that was just the first day of a story that would last a lifetime. Far away, the Alpha King stopped before the empty cribs and felt the absence like a silent blow. He did not know that night that the coming years would be made of longing, searching, and hope shattered in silence. He only knew that his little wolves had disappeared, and that the emptiness in the castle was too great to be just loss. Years later, in the middle of an expedition on the mountain, the Alpha King spotted a woman in the distance. Two young wolves followed close behind her, as if that were the safest place in the world. He stopped without realizing it. One of the pups turned first, the other came right after. And then the two pairs of golden eyes met his. The king felt his blood run cold. Those eyes, they were his own. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories. And you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The bread was small, hard, the kind that was left behind at the end of the day because even the rats didn't want it anymore. And it was exactly that insignificant piece of bread that changed Lyra's life forever. She had been standing in front of Berto's stall for too long for someone who had no intention of buying anything. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Just pretending to inspect a wheel of cheese she could never afford, while her stomach twisted in a dull ache that had stopped feeling unusual days ago. 4 days without a real meal had a strange effect. First came weakness, then habit, and then that humiliating ability to stay standing as if nothing was wrong. Lyra stayed standing. Chin up, shoulders back. Presentable, barely. Banished Omega or not, she wasn't going to drag herself through Vale's square looking like she was apologizing for existing. Across the square, old Marin sat trembling on a wooden bench. His lips were cracked. His face shone with fever. He had been coughing since morning, and Lyra had heard it from the entrance of the makeshift shelter where she had spent the night. Marin had no money, no family, no one. She didn't either, but she was standing. And he wasn't. That was the difference, she thought. Her hand moved before the thought was finished. Fast, clean. The bread disappeared into the fold of her worn coat, and Lyra crossed the few steps to Marin before anyone noticed. She knelt without ceremony, placed the bread in his shaking hands, and closed his fingers around it with careful gentleness. He looked at her with wet eyes, trying to thank her without having enough strength left to speak. "You don't need to," she murmured, and stood to leave. "Thief!" The word cracked through the square like thunder. Lyra stopped. She didn't run. That was what they expected. Running would confirm guilt. Fear would be the confession they wanted to drag out of her without effort. Berto was already on his feet behind the stall, his face so red it looked ready to burst. "That Omega stole my bread," he shouted, pointing at her like his finger was a weapon. "Look at her. She's from the Grey clan. Always begging, always asking for handouts, asking and asking. And now she's become a thief." Heads turned one by one. Lyra knew almost every face in the square. Old Soraya, who had once taken herbs from her when her daughter was sick. Don the blacksmith, who had let her help wrap a baby in warm cloth on a freezing night. The butcher with the stained apron, who had accepted the medicine she made for his gout without paying a coin for it. None of them said a word. Of course they didn't. The silence of the people she had helped hurt more than any insult. Not because it was surprising, because it was never surprising. Lyra drew in a slow breath. Bitterness was exhausting, and she was already too tired to carry any more of it. "I took the bread," she said. Her voice came out steady, no tremor. "I took it to give to Marin. He's sick, he has no money, and he'll starve if no one does something." Berto stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "That's not my problem." Lyra held his gaze. "No, the problem is what you call yours." The line came out sharper than she intended, and for one strange moment the square went still, as if everyone had inhaled at once. Then Elder Prade appeared from the crowd. He was 80 years old, with eyebrows too thick for his own face and a voice that carried the weight of decades of law. He walked slowly, but not from weakness, from purpose. "Lyra of the Grey Line," he said. "You were seen stealing in the public square. The law is clear." She looked at him without blinking. "I'm not denying what I did." "Then you are not denying the punishment." Lyra hesitated only a second before answering, but it felt longer. "I'm denying that it makes me unworthy." Prade studied her for a heartbeat. Then he turned his face away as though she was no longer worth the effort it took to argue. "Leave Vielle. Do not return. You no longer have a place here." And then someone threw mud. It missed, but it opened the door. More mud followed. More voices. The humiliation came in waves. "Shame on the clan. You should be ashamed. Not even a proper wolf. Omega without a pack. Go live in the rocks with the animals who deserve you." Lyra stopped distinguishing one voice from the next. There comes a point when collective cruelty stops sounding like people and becomes only violence. She turned and walked. Back straight. Hands still. Step by measured step. She crossed Vale's Square for the last time, as if she were walking through a royal hall and not through a place that had only welcomed her until it no longer found her useful. Only when the last houses were behind her and the stone road gave way to dirt did she stop. She leaned against a wide oak tree, closed her eyes, and breathed. That kind of pain does not cry right away. It settles deep. It spreads roots. It comes back weeks later in some unexpected moment, when someone uses a word that should no longer mean anything. Lyra stayed as long as she needed to. Then she lifted her head, adjusted her worn coat over her shoulders, and kept going. The sky had changed by the time she noticed. Not the ordinary purple of sunset. The other kind. Deeper. Heavier. The color that made the old people of Vale pull their children indoors and lock their windows as if that could stop what was coming. The great storm was arriving. Every cycle, the same thing happened. Dark violet skies, biting wind, rain that came sideways, and days when the forest seemed to breathe wrong. Things happened during the storm. Things no one liked to name. Lyra had no window to board up. No supplies. No place to go. She looked to the forest on her right, growing darker by the minute as the branches began to bend under the wind. She looked to the mountain ahead, its peaks already swallowed by mist. She looked at the empty road behind her and understood that, for the first time in a long time, there was no good choice. Then she heard it. A low sound. Wet. Desperate. She turned slowly. In the middle of the road, where mud was beginning to gather under the first heavy drops of rain, there were 2 wolf pups. Small. White with golden markings on their muzzles. Twins, clearly. Not identical, but close enough to create that brief moment of confusion where the eye insists it is seeing the same creature twice. They were pressed against each other, noses down, eyes wide and golden, with that particular look pups get when they realize the world has become too large all at once. Lyra stood still for a moment. The 2 of them lifted their heads at the same time and looked straight at her. For some reason, that was almost worse. She crouched slowly. "Hi," she said, using the softest voice she could manage. The pups looked at each other. "Did you see that? She talked to us." The one on the left took a hesitant step forward. The one on the right stayed still a second longer, as though refusing to look eager, then took 2 steps at once as if that would correct the matter. Lyra held out her hand. They sniffed it, then nudged her fingers with their noses. The one on the right even gave her finger a tiny testing nip, as if checking whether she was real or just another bad idea brought on by the storm. She looked around. Nothing. No adult. No clear trail. No call. No pack. Just road, mud, and the storm closing in. "What are you doing out here alone?" she murmured. The pups, of course, did not answer. The first gust of wind slammed across the road, sending dry leaves spinning and making the trees groan. The first thick drops of rain hit the mud. The pups huddled together and shivered, not just from cold. Lyra drew in a slow breath. The world had just left her without a home, and now it was dropping 2 orphans in her path as if this were some kind of plan. "All right," she said, more to herself than to them. "We're going up the mountain." She opened her coat. The 2 of them climbed inside without hesitation, one on each side, pressing against her chest as if that were the most natural thing in the world. Small, warm, alive. Lyra felt their heat through the rough fabric and started up the trail. The mountain was unforgiving on a good day. On the edge of the storm, it was worse. Rain thickened as she climbed the narrow path. The wind hit from the side, trying to throw her off balance on the slick stones. One of the pups poked his nose out of her coat, looked down, and immediately retreated, offended by the height. "Now is not the time for sightseeing," Lyra muttered. He stared at her with a seriousness that, in such a tiny pup, was almost ridiculous. Then he burrowed back against her chest. Halfway up the slope there was a small cave, deep enough to keep out the rain and wide enough to hold a fire without filling with smoke. Lyra knew the place from an old herb-gathering route, a memory from a life when she could still walk through Vielle without being treated like an error. She reached it just as the sky went fully dark. She set the pups on the ground. The one on the left immediately began inspecting the cave with methodical precision. The one on the right went straight to the back, returned 2 seconds later, and sat with the solemn expression of someone who had decided the place was acceptable, though still in need of supervision. Lyra looked at them and exhaled slowly. "Stay here." The left one stayed. The right one came closer, bumped her knee with his nose, and lay down beside her foot as though he had already decided that was where his future would begin. Lyra tried to make fire with the calm of someone who refused to admit she was shaking. She had a gatherer's knife, a strip of leather, a few dried trem-trem leaves, and enough stones to keep trying. The third attempt worked. A tiny flame. Real. The pups edged closer, sniffing the warmth with the cautious wonder of creatures who had not yet decided whether the world deserved trust. The one on the left calculated the ideal distance and sat exactly outside the danger zone. The one on the right went straight for the flame, sneezed at the smoke, recoiled in offended outrage, and went back in for another try. "It'll burn you again," Lyra told him. He looked at her as if that possibility was deeply unfair. Then he stuck his nose toward the fire a third time. "Impressive," she murmured, and something almost like a smile flickered over her face. The storm hit in the middle of the night. It did not knock, it invaded. Wind roared around the mountain like an enormous invisible beast. Rain lashed the stone, and thunder shook the air hard enough to make the floor vibrate beneath them. The pups woke. The left one folded in on himself inside the leather scrap, leaving only his tail exposed, still, tense, and completely betrayed by fear. The right one sat rigid, staring toward the cave entrance as if trying to be brave on principle. A bolt of lightning tore through the sky. The thunder came a moment later, brutal and close. The left pup shot out of the leather and into Lyra's lap. The right one hesitated for a heartbeat, too proud to run, and then walked to her with the solemnity of someone making a strategic decision. He lay down against her side. Lyra ended up with one pup in her lap and the other clinging to her arm. Then she started to hum. It wasn't a clan song. It wasn't a hymn. It had no words at all. Just a low, steady melody, old and soft. The same one she had hummed when she was a child and the rain felt too large for her bedroom. The left pup stopped shaking first. The right one resisted longer, stubborn to the end. Then he gave in. Outside, the storm raged as if it knew it was losing. Far away, at the Palace of the Frost Towers, King Rurick froze in the hallway outside his son's room and knew before anyone spoke that something was wrong. The cribs were empty. The two pups, his only family, were nowhere to be found. Rurick did not shout. What he did was worse. He stood utterly still, staring at the empty cribs until the silence around him became unbearable. Then he turned to General Torvek. "Find them." His voice was low, tight, dangerous because of how controlled it was. "Your Majesty, the storm is coming," Torvek said carefully. "In a few hours the forest will be. Then we have fewer hours than I'd like." Rurick was already moving. "Prepare the horses." "Majesty, you do not intend to go yourself." "Prepare the horses." No one argued after that, because no one needed to. Rurick mounted within the hour and rode toward the forest with the brutal certainty of someone who had already understood that this was not just a rescue. It was fatherhood. It was fear. It was fate, taking shape as panic. The storm lasted 4 days. On the 4th, the wind finally eased, and the sky turned gray instead of deep violet. Lyra stepped out of the cave with the two pups behind her, both of them restless and full of that irritating energy young creatures get when they have been still too long, and now intend to make up for it all at once. She stood at the mouth of the cave and looked down into the valley. Vielle was no longer an option. Going down with no destination was not one either. The pups returned from exploring and looked up at her, as if waiting for a plan. Lyra lifted her chin and looked out at the open road ahead. For the first time since she had been cast out, she did not feel like she was running. She felt like she was beginning. The storm had passed, but the mountain did not know it yet. The wind still scraped the mountain ridges, though less like a beast now and more like something restless and hungry. Rain dripped from the cave mouth in slow, uneven drops. The fire had burned down to a red core under a scatter of ash, and Lyra woke with one pup on her chest and the other curled across her knees, both of them warm, heavy, and completely unwilling to move first. The one on her chest lifted his head when she shifted and sneezed directly into her collar. Lyra stared at him. He stared back, offended. "That was on purpose," she muttered. The pup sneezed again, louder this time, as if to prove a point. His brother, the one across her knees, opened one eye, looked at both of them, and let out a tiny sigh that somehow managed to sound judgmental. "Don't start," Lyra told him. "You were snoring like a broken flute." The brother's ear twitched. It was the closest thing to a dignified insult she had ever received from a creature barely tall enough to reach her ankle. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her back. 4 days of storm had turned her muscles into knots. 4 days of guarding 2 frightened pups, keeping the fire alive, and listening to thunder shake the cave had left her feeling as though she had wrestled the mountain and lost. The pups had not suffered similarly, which she found deeply unfair. They were awake now, alert in the way only children and disasters knew how to be. The left one padded to the cave entrance and looked out with grave seriousness. The other circled her once, sniffed the hem of her coat, and then sat directly on the place where her boot should have been. "Very helpful," Lyra said. He blinked at her, then sat harder. She scratched behind his ear. He leaned into the touch with such complete trust that it made something tight in her chest shift painfully. The other one saw this and immediately came over with the air of a creature not at all motivated by jealousy, only by a desire to verify the quality of the service. Lyra scratched him too. Both pups sat as if they had just won a formal agreement. That was not a competition, she told them. The left pup sneezed. The right one looked smug about it. She broke one of the dried meat strips into 3 pieces, 2 equal pieces, 1 insulting piece. The pups watched in tense silence. The left pup got the first piece and ate it with noble restraint. The right one received the smaller one, stared at it like it had personally offended him, and then accepted it anyway with all the dignity he could manage. "You two are going to be impossible," Lyra muttered. The right pup sniffed her cuff, clearly checking whether there was more hidden there. "There isn't," she said. He looked unconvinced. They had barely finished when Lyra heard it. Not thunder, boots. She froze. The pups froze too, both of them looking up at her at once, as if waiting for instructions. That alone was enough to tighten her throat. They were listening. Not just to her voice, but to the way her body changed. Another set of boots. Then another. Men. Close. Lyra moved to the cave mouth and peered out through the rain. 6 figures were climbing the path below, cloaks dark with water, heads down against the wind. Rurick's guards. Her stomach went cold. She knew those insignias. Everyone on the mountain did. They came with law in one hand and theft in the other. Her mother had once called them wolves with polished boots and empty stomachs for other people's blood. Lyra had learned young that when Rurick's men appeared, someone always paid for it. She swore under her breath. The right pup pressed against her calf. The left one tucked himself against her ankle with fierce loyalty and exactly zero understanding of why the air had changed. "Stay quiet," she whispered. Both pups stared at her as if silence were their natural state, until she needed it to be a moral duty. The guards split at the base of the trail, 2 moving east, 2 around the rock wall, the last pair pausing to scan the slope. Efficient, trained, hard to outrun. Lyra stepped back inside the cave. "There are people outside." The pups looked at her. The bad kind. That got their attention. The left one gave a tiny growl. The right one made a sound that was supposed to be a growl too, but came out suspiciously squeaky. Lyra had to bite the inside of her cheek. "Yes," she whispered. "Terrifying." She packed fast. Water skin, knife, meat, cloth, fire starter. Then she looked at the pups and cursed softly. There was no way to leave them here. The left pup had already climbed halfway into the water skin pouch. The right one was standing on the leather scrap like he had been appointed lookout. "Fine," Lyra muttered. "You can both be brave from inside my coat." The one in the pouch sneezed in protest. "Excellent," she told him. "Now you smell like wet fur and poor judgment." A shout rang out from the path. Too close. Lyra did not wait. She ducked low, crossed the back of the cave, and slipped into a narrow crack in the stone that opened behind a line of thorn brush. She had found it years ago while gathering herbs. Too tight for most adults. Too ugly for anyone to bother checking twice. Perfect. She crawled through, coat clutched over the pups, mud scraping her palms and knees. One of the pups wriggled in outrage at the indignity of the transport method. "You wanted adventure," she whispered. He looked at her from inside the coat with open offense. This, apparently, was not what he had meant. The crack opened onto a narrow ledge on the far side of the cave wall. Below it, the mountain dropped into a steep ravine filled with wet stones and slick roots. Lyra took one look and decided the mountain could go to hell. A voice shouted behind her. Boots scraped stone. No time. She dropped. The fall was short, but not short enough. Her boots hit the lower shelf badly, her knee buckled, and she grabbed at a root to keep from sliding into the ravine. One pup gave a tiny squeak inside her coat. "I know," she hissed. "I hate this too." She pushed on. Rain ran in sheets across the rock face. She moved through black pines and broken roots, ducking low, keeping the pups buried against her ribs. Behind her, the voices grew sharper. Then a flash of movement below caught her eye. She froze. At the bend in the lower path stood a tall figure in a dark cloak, broad-shouldered and still as a statue in the rain. Rurick, not alone. 2 guards stood behind him. He was looking uphill, jaw tight, scanning the storm with the stillness of a man holding panic in a fist. Then the right pup shifted under her coat and let out a tiny whine. Rurick's head snapped toward the sound. He saw her. Not clearly. Not enough for details. But enough. Lyra saw the change in him at once. The sudden stillness. The hard focus. The way his body went rigid as if the world had just tilted under his feet. He had heard the pup. He had seen enough to know something was wrong. And in that second, he knew she was there. Lyra swore and moved. "By the moons," one of the guards shouted, pointing up the slope. Rurick stepped forward. For one breath, she thought he might give the order to come after her. The younger guard did start toward the water. Rurick caught him by the arm and dragged him back before he could make the crossing. "Don't!" he barked. The boy stumbled, looked offended, and then the storm swallowed the rest. Lyra did not wait to see more. She cut through the trees, taking the route nobody liked because the roots twisted underfoot and the ground shifted in strange places. A branch whipped across her face. The pup stayed buried in her coat now, silent in a way she was beginning to trust only when she had no choice. The ravine ended at a stream swollen with runoff, the water wild and gray and moving too fast to be harmless. Lyra stopped at the bank, looked once at the churn of it, and then back at the storm-black sky above. "Of course," she muttered. "Why not?" She stepped in. The current slammed into her legs hard enough to steal balance. Cold rushed through muscle and bone. She stumbled, caught herself on a submerged stone, and forced another step. The coat dragged against the water. The pups gave one alarmed squeak and then went quiet again, which she appreciated and resented in equal measure. One pup poked his nose out. The other clung tighter. "Don't panic," Lyra said. The one by her collar looked deeply insulted. "I was not panicking," his expression very clearly said. "I was assessing disaster." "Same thing," Lyra muttered and kept moving. A shout carried over the wind. Closer now. She shoved through the last stretch, half sliding, half climbing up the opposite bank. Mud gave way under her boot, and she nearly went down. A hand reached the water behind her, one of the guards too brave or too stupid, but the current yanked him off balance and his superior dragged him back with a curse. Good. Lyra did not stop to feel relief. She ran. Branches tore at her coat. Rain blinded her. Her knee screamed with every step, but she kept moving until the trees thickened enough to hide her. Only then did she lean against a trunk and suck in one shaking breath after another. The pups were still alive, still warm, still tucked against her like they belonged there. The right one sneezed directly into her throat. Lyra closed her eyes. "That," she whispered, "was rude." The pup huffed. His brother made a tiny sound that might have been laughter if laughter came with damp fur and questionable life choices. Lyra looked down at them, exhausted enough to laugh herself. "You two are impossible." They stared up at her with identical solemnity. Then, much later than she wanted, the storm began to weaken. The wind lost some of its teeth. The rain thinned. By then, Lyra had found a hollow beneath a fallen cedar, hidden from the worst of the weather, and almost dry if one ignored the mud, which she did. The pups curled inside her coat and finally slept. Lyra stayed awake, because storms rarely ended cleanly, and because somewhere beyond the trees, she could still feel the shape of the search, the guards on the mountain, the weight of what she had stumbled into, the reason the world kept moving as if it were chasing her specifically. Far away, a wolf howled, then another. Then, deeper than the rest, a sound that made the air around her tighten. Lyra lifted her head. The pups stirred. The storm had not ended. It had only made room for something else. The days after the storm blurred into weeks, then months, then a rhythm that Lyra had not expected to find. The pups grew faster than anything she had ever seen. One morning they could barely reach her knee. The next, they were chasing rabbits through the brush like they had been born doing it. She taught them to hunt. They taught her to listen. The mountain gave them shelter. The forest gave them food. And Rurick's men gave them practice. First once, then twice, then so many times that Lyra stopped counting the close calls and started memorizing the boots. They moved 3 times in 7 years. Each time because the guards got too close. Each time because the twins grew bolder, and boldness left tracks. And then, without warning, the pups were not pups anymore. 7 years later, Lyra had learned that silence among wolf pups was never a good sign. If both pups went quiet at once, it meant one of 3 things. Something was broken, something was stolen, or something was about to make her life significantly more difficult. So when the cave felt too still, she looked up from the herbs she had been sorting and frowned toward the entrance. "Absolutely not," she muttered. No answer. That was worse. She set the bundle aside, wiped dirt from her hands, and walked to the cave mouth with the slow dread of a woman who had spent 7 years raising 2 wolf pups and still had not earned a single calm afternoon. Fen and Dane had vanished into the trees. Of course they had. "Of course," she said to the empty air, "because I apparently can't have one day without chaos." The morning had been soft and warm, the kind of mountain light that made everything look almost kind. Pine branches shifted in the breeze. The stream below sang through the rocks. For a brief moment, Lyra had thought the mountain might let her breathe. Then she found the first sign. A boot print. Fresh. Deep. Too sharp for a traveler. Lyra crouched and touched the edge of it. Her body went still. Rurick's men. She knew their boots by now. The guards of the king moved like law and looked like hunger. They had taken enough from enough people to make fear feel practical. Then she saw the camp. It had been abandoned in a hurry, but not in confusion. The fire ring was still warm underneath the ash. A bedroll had been tossed aside. A cloak lay half-buried near the pines. And from the center of the clearing came a muffled yip, followed by a second, sharper sound that was clearly indignant. Lyra closed her eyes for one beat. "Stars help me." She rounded the pines and stopped. Fen and Dane were in the middle of the clearing, like they owned it. Fen had Rurick's cloak in his mouth. Dine was sitting on a collapsed bedroll with the solemn air of a judge passing sentence. Lyra stared. They stared back. Fen sneezed, then dropped the cloak and looked offended that the world had reacted badly to his contribution. Dine tilted his head as if to say, "We found a thing. Surely you're proud." Lyra looked from them to the camp and felt something in her chest tighten. Rurick had been here recently. Too recently. Whatever he had been looking for, he had lost it. She picked up the cloak. Dark blue wool. Silver trim. Royal quality. The inside still held the smell of cedar, rain, and the stormy edge of the man who wore it. Rurick. The scent did something unpleasant to her breathing. She did not know why that bothered her. The pups did not care. They were batting a tin cup back and forth like it was a trophy. Of course, Lyra muttered. Because I'm the responsible one here. A branch snapped behind her. She turned. A guard stepped out of the pines, young and hard-faced, with Rurick's insignia bright on his cloak. He saw the pups first, then the cloak in her hand, then her. His mouth opened. Found. Lyra moved before the word finished. She threw the cloak into his face, snatched both pups in one motion and ran. The guard shouted behind her. Boots hit the ground hard. Lyra did not have time for dignity. Only downhill. She cut through the trees, Fen under one arm and Dane under the other, both of them wriggling furiously at being carried like sacks of grain. "Stop kicking," she hissed. Dane bit her sleeve. "Do that again and I'll name you Soup." He stopped immediately, insulted on principle. Fen twisted enough to look back at the guard and made a tiny growl that sounded more like a hiccup. "Terrifying," Lyra muttered. "Truly." Then a second voice cracked through the trees. "Hold!" Older, colder, meaner. A captain stepped out of the ridge path above, broad-shouldered and armored, with the sort of face that had forgotten kindness long ago. He looked at the pups, then at Lyra, and something in his expression sharpened with satisfaction. "There they are," he said. Lyra's stomach dropped. Not found. There they are, as if the pups were property already claimed. The younger guard hesitated. "Captain, the king ordered—" "The king is not here," the captain said. "And those pups do not belong to some mountain vagabond." Vagabond. Lyra almost laughed, though there was nothing funny in it. She knew what that insignia meant. She had seen it before on men who called cruelty law and called that justice. Her mother had died with one of them standing over her. So yes, she ran. She plunged deeper into the trees, over roots and wet stone, the pups tucked tight against her body. Fen and Dane had gone quiet now, pressed against her ribs with the hard little tension of creatures who knew fear but trusted her more. That trust hit her harder than the rain. The ravine opened ahead. A stream roared below, swollen from runoff, too fast to be safe. Behind her, the captain shouted again, "Don't let her cross!" Lyra reached the edge, looked down once, and swore. "Of course," she said. "Why wouldn't it be a river?" She stepped in. Cold hit like a fist. The current shoved at her knees, then her thighs, then tried to drag her sideways. Her boot slipped on a stone. She caught herself with one hand, keeping both pups pinned against her chest. Fen gave a tiny squeak. "I know," she panted. "I hate it too." An arrow whizzed past her and struck a tree trunk several feet away. Too close. The twins stiffened but stayed silent. Good boys. Then another shout cut through the storm. Not the captain, not the guards. Rurick. The sound of his voice hit her like pressure, low and furious and too close to ignore. She had never met him, and yet some part of her had already begun to know him. That made no sense. It made even less sense when she lifted her head and saw him on the far bank, soaked to the skin, staring across the water with the rigid stillness of a man trying not to break. He was not alone. Men stood behind him, but he was the one she noticed. The rain ran down his face. His jaw was clenched so hard it looked like it hurt. When Dain shifted in her arm and gave a tiny whine, Rurick's head snapped toward the sound. Then he saw her. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. His whole body went still, not just startled, struck. Lyra felt that in the center of her chest before she understood it. He had seen the shape of her, and something in him had answered. The captain lunged toward the bank. Rurick caught his arm hard enough to stop him. "Back," he said. The word cracked across the ravine. The captain froze, furious. The younger guard tried to step into the water anyway, but Rurick dragged him back before he could commit to the crossing. That was the first time Lyra believed he might actually be different from the others. The current yanked at her again. She pushed through, half sliding up the opposite bank and into the trees before anyone could get another clear shot. Only when the sound of boots faded behind her did she stop. Her heart was hammering so hard it felt like pain. Dane sneezed into her collar. Lyra shut her eyes. "That," she whispered, "was incredibly rude." The pup huffed. Fen made a tiny sound that might have been laughter if laughter came with wet fur and bad timing. Lyra looked down at them and almost smiled despite herself. Then she kept moving. The rest of the day passed in broken stretches of mud, rain, and false starts. She found a shallow hollow under a cedar where the wind could not reach them fully. Fen and Dane curled inside her coat, one against her throat, the other tucked beneath her arm, and finally slept. Lyra stayed awake. Because storms rarely ended cleanly, and because somewhere beyond the trees, she could still feel the shape of the chase. By late afternoon, she found the camp again, or what was left of it. The fire ring, the bedroll, the cloak she had taken from the guard, now damp and ruined. And beside the ash, half washed by rain, a name scratched into the dirt. Lord Halvin. Lyra stared at it for a long time. Fen and Dane sat on either side of her, both very still now, as if they understood that something had changed. "Of course it's you," she murmured. Fen looked up. Dane tilted his head. Lyra pointed at the name. "That's the kind of man who smiles while sharpening knives." Dane bared his tiny teeth at the dirt. Fen sneezed as if to say, "Excellent. We hate him immediately." Lyra gave a short, exhausted breath that might almost have been a laugh. "Good," she said. "I was worried you'd be unreasonable." The wind shifted. Far off, thunder rolled over the mountain again, lower this time, as if the storm itself was moving on. But Lyra knew better than to trust that. Rurick had seen her. The twins had a name now, and Lord Halvin had just made the whole thing personal. Lyra did not like the way the name sat in the dirt. It was too neat for a mistake and too casual for mercy. Lord Halvin. She stared at it until the rain blurred the edges, then looked down at Fen and Dane, who were sitting on either side of her with the grave attention of tiny wolves who had recently decided they understood politics. "Do not look proud," she told them. "I have not solved anything yet." Fen sneezed. Dane looked personally offended by the concept of patience. Lyra rubbed a hand over her face and rose to her feet. Her coat was damp through, her boots full of mud, her muscles aching from the run, the crossing, and the general insult of the day. The storm had softened into a gray wash over the mountain, but the air still felt charged, as if the sky had not finished deciding how much trouble to cause. "Come on," she murmured. The pups followed immediately. Of course they did. They had that particular sort of trust that made her chest ache if she thought about it for too long. Not blind trust. Better than that. The trust of creatures who had already learned that she would come back for them. That was a dangerous thing to be given. By the time they reached the cave, Fen and Dane were damp, prickly, and deeply committed to shaking water everywhere except off themselves. Lyra closed the entrance behind them and lit the fire with 2 strikes. Fen sat by the flame and tried to stare dignity into it. Dane leaned so far forward that Lyra had to catch the back of his neck before he singed his whiskers. "Absolutely not." He blinked at her as if she had overreacted. "You are not allowed to become a cautionary tale before lunch." That earned her one offended huff and a very long look that suggested he had opinions about her management style. Lyra set the cloak over a stone, then crouched and checked the pups over for injuries. No blood. A few scratches. One mud stain that had somehow migrated to Fen's ear. "Perfect," she said dryly. "You're both disasters, but at least you're intact." Dane immediately lunged for the dried meat pouch. "Don't start," she said. He froze, offended that she had guessed his intent so accurately. She divided the last strip into 3 parts again, and the pups watched with open suspicion. "The smaller piece is not an insult," she told Dane. "It's a lesson." He did not believe her. He took the piece anyway. Fen, meanwhile, had discovered that if he pressed his nose into the fold of her sleeve and sighed dramatically, she would scratch behind his ears faster. "You are both going to be impossible adults," Lyra told them. Dane gave her a look that made it clear he was already an adult in all the ways that mattered. Lyra snorted. Then she remembered the name in the dirt and the chill in Rurick's voice and the way his eyes had locked on her across the river. Not the eyes of a king. The eyes of a man who had nearly lost something and knew it. That thought sat strangely in her chest. She did not like it. She did not dislike it either, which was worse. "Eat," she said to the pups too sharply. They both obeyed at once. That startled her more than anything else. Fen chewed with careful discipline. Dane swallowed his piece in 2 bites and then sat waiting with the focused patience of someone preparing for a second betrayal. There was no second piece. He looked at her anyway. "No," Lyra said before he could begin. He sat down harder. She pointed at the entrance. "If you're going to judge me, do it outside." He blinked, then sneezed at her. "You're learning manners," she muttered. Not well, but enough to be annoying. She should have slept then, should have let the day end. Instead, she went back to the cave mouth and looked out at the mountain. There were no guards in sight. That was almost worse. Silence meant they were regrouping. Silence meant they had not given up. And silence meant Halvin had already won whatever he had planned today, because men like that never moved without thinking 3 steps ahead. The pups padded over and stopped beside her. Fen pressed his shoulder lightly into her leg. Dane sat and stared down the slope. Lyra looked from one to the other. "You feel it too, don't you?" They did not answer, but the way both pairs of ears turned at once toward the lower ridge told her enough. She narrowed her eyes. Something had moved below. Not a guard. Not exactly. A rider. Lyra watched the line of trees far down the slope until the figure became just visible through the mist. 1 horse, 1 man, moving alone where no one with sense should have been moving alone after a storm. The silhouette stopped at the old ridge track. Not the main route. The hidden one. Rurick's route. Lyra's breath caught. The man dismounted and disappeared behind the pines. She did not know why that mattered so much. She only knew it did. The pups looked up at her, matching her stillness with an instinct that was becoming infuriatingly familiar. "We are not going after him," she said. Dine looked at her like that had not been the question at all. "Don't start." Fen sneezed. Lyra sighed. "Fine. We are absolutely not going after him in a way that makes me look deranged." That seemed to satisfy no one. An hour later, she did go after him. Not because she wanted to, because the mountain had started to feel wrong. The sort of wrong that meant someone had passed through recently, left something behind, and expected it not to be found. Lyra tucked the pups into a sling made from her coat and moved downhill through the trees, following the shallow track of disturbed moss and broken pine needles. The pups were silent for nearly 5 full minutes, which was enough to become deeply suspicious. Then Dane poked his nose out and sneezed directly into her collar. Lyra jerked. "Of course," she muttered. "You saved that for when I was trying to be stealthy." He blinked at her from the fabric fold with the expression of someone who considered stealth a system built on lies. The ridge track curved around a stand of black rock and opened into a small clearing. A camp had been there, though not long ago. The fire pit still held warmth under the ash. A bedroll had been rolled in haste. One water skin had split open and soaked into the dirt. Someone had left in a hurry, not Rurick. He would not leave a camp like that. He would clean it, or at least try. This had been Halvin's people. Lyra crouched and found the proof almost immediately. A broken seal melted into wax, the kind used for private correspondence. A signet ring had pressed into the ash. It bore a crest she did not recognize, but it had the polished arrogance of wealth. The pups sniffed the air and made disgusted little noises. "Exactly," she said. "I hate him too, and I have not even seen his face." She followed the tracks a little farther and found the real clue. A bundle of cloth, hidden under a rock, wrapped around something hard and rectangular. She opened it. A letter. Not sealed. Mistake or arrogance. Lyra unfolded the page and read. It took her 3 breaths to understand the worst of it. Halvin was not just moving the pups. He had arranged for the palace nursery to be left unsecured, not unguarded. Unsecured. A difference that meant intent. The pups had not wandered. They had been placed, handed off, taken as part of a plan to make it look like a storm accident. And the letter did not stop there. It named others, men in the council, a border commander, one of the king's household healers. Lyra's mouth went dry. The pups, sensing the change in her body, pressed close. Dane let out a tiny growl at the paper. "Not that kind of monster," she murmured, though she had the feeling he would have fought the paper anyway. She stared at the page until the words blurred. Then she read the final line again. "If the king breaks, the succession falls to those prepared to preserve the realm." The handwriting was neat, careful, civilized. That made it worse. Dane climbed onto her knee and bit the edge of the letter. "Do not eat evidence," Lyra told him. He stared at her, then at the letter, then back. Fen made a tiny sound that was almost a sigh, as if to say, "You are doing this poorly." Lyra gave him a flat look. "You try being me." He did not, as far as she could tell, enjoy the challenge. She tucked the letter into her coat and kept moving. She had to find Rurick, or at least his trail. The storm had scattered the mountain, but Rurick's path was still visible to someone who knew where to look. She found him near the far ridge, not face to face, not yet, just the aftermath of him, a collapsed rest point beneath the stone shelf, a cloak pinned under a branch where he had probably yanked it loose in anger, a crushed cup, and most telling of all, a place where he had sat long enough to leave the impression of a man trying to hold himself together through sheer effort. Lyra stopped there. The pup sat at her feet. Something about the place made her chest tighten, not just because of the king, because of what she could feel in the air. There was grief here, old grief, carried hard enough to wear grooves into the world around it. She had expected a ruler, maybe a warrior, maybe a man used to command. She had not expected the shape of exhaustion. "You've been here a while," she murmured to no one. Fen sniffed the cloak and sneezed. Dane sat very straight and stared toward the ridge as if he were trying to find the man who had lost it. Lyra should not have done it. She did it anyway. She lifted the cloak and held it against her own coat. The scent of him hit her like a quiet blow. Rain, cedar, smoke, and something beneath all that. Not weakness, never weakness, but the raw, sleepless edge of a man who had been surviving only because he refused to collapse where other people could see. Lyra went still. That was the moment the world shifted. Not dramatically, not with thunder, just enough that she knew she would remember it later. The pups, sensing something in her, pressed both sides of her legs with their small, warm bodies. Lyra swallowed hard and looked back down the path. Halvin was out there. Rurick was out there. And she, apparently, was standing in the middle of a storm with 2 pups and the beginning of a war in her hands. "Wonderful," she said quietly. "Absolutely wonderful." Dine barked once, sharp and tiny. She looked down. "Yes, I know. It's terrible. I'm glad you're here too." He seemed pleased by that. Fen leaned into her ankle. That did it. She laughed once, low and tired, and kept moving before the feeling could settle into something more dangerous. By the time she returned to the cave, the sky had gone from gray to silver blue, and the pups were so drowsy they nearly fell asleep standing up. Lyra tucked them in close, set the letter under a stone, and sat with her back to the wall. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt watched. Not by anyone visible. By the shape of the future. And somewhere beyond the mountain, Rurick was still out there surviving the same storm, carrying grief like a second crown. Rurick had not slept in 2 days. That was the clean version. The true version was uglier. He had rested in pieces. 1 hour sitting upright by the fire, 1 hour with his eyes closed and his hand still wrapped around a child's blanket, 1 hour listening to wind hammer the palace windows while his mind replayed every error he had made since the pups were born. He was very good at command, less good at guilt. The palace had become a machine around him, one that moved because he forced it to. Men saluted, couriers ran, guards obeyed, servants lowered their eyes. None of it mattered. The nursery was still empty. The cribs still sat like accusations. The blankets had been folded and refolded until the fabric wore soft at the edges. One of his sons had loved chewing the corner of that blue one. The other had preferred the one with the stitched moon. Now, both were gone. Rurick sat at the nursery door long after the rest of the palace had gone quiet, and wondered how much of a king a man could remain when he had failed the only 2 people who trusted him without question. The answer, he suspected, was not much. A knock sounded. "Enter," he said. General Torvek came in, rein on his shoulders, fatigue in the set of his jaw. He carried a folded report and the expression of a man trying to choose mercy in advance. "We found something," Torvek said. Rurick stood so fast the chair scraped the floor. "Where?" "On the ridge, not far from the stream. One of the search parties found an abandoned camp." Rurick's pulse hit hard once in his throat. "Speak." Torvek hesitated only a moment before unfolding the paper. "There are signs the pups were moved deliberately. Someone from inside the palace had access. The camp belonged to Halvin's road party." Rurick went still. Halvin. The name was almost enough to make his vision sharpen. Torvek watched him carefully. "There's more. A letter was found." Rurick held out a hand. Torvek gave it over. He read in silence. The first line was enough. The second made him feel cold all the way through. By the time he reached the end, his hands were steady, only because rage had gone crystalline. "This is treason," he said quietly. "Yes, sire. Who else knows? Only the search party and myself." Rurick folded the page once and set it down with care that took effort. Then he looked at the empty nursery, then at the blanket in his hand, then at the ceiling, as if he could see through it to the storm still moving across the mountain. He had spent 7 years ruling a kingdom that respected his strength and feared his temper. None of it had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for the sound of silence in his son's room. "I want every name on that letter," he said. "You'll have them." "I want Halvin contained." Torvek bowed his head, already in motion. Rurick exhaled once, sharply. Then, because grief had stripped him of the ability to pretend, he lowered himself back into the chair at the nursery door and covered his eyes with one hand. For a moment, there was nothing but the storm and the ache behind his ribs. He was a king. He was supposed to be harder than this. But there was no hardness left for his children. Only fear, and a kind of love that made fear intolerable. Torvek did not speak. That was why Rurick trusted him. After a long silence, the general said, "The search party also found traces of a woman." Rurick's hand dropped from his face. "What woman?" "Not named, no clear identity. But she was with the pups. The tracks suggest she took them in during the storm." Rurick's chest tightened. A woman. He should have asked what she looked like, what she wore, whether she had spoken, whether she had been armed. Instead, the first thought that came to him was absurdly simple. She saved them. He hated that his heart responded to that before his mind did. "Find her," he said. Torvek studied him. Sire? Find her, Rurick repeated, quieter this time. And do it before Halvin does. Torvek gave a single, sharp nod. When he left, Rurick finally rose and crossed to the window. The mountain lay far beyond the city walls, hidden under the same storm that had swallowed his sons from him. Somewhere out there was a woman he had never met, who had held his children through thunder and kept them alive while he failed them from a palace too far away. That fact sat in him like a flame. Not relief. Not yet. But something warmer than despair. He closed his hand around the edge of the window ledge. If Halvin thought this would break him into surrender, he was wrong. This would do the opposite. The door opened again, and a servant stepped in with a tray of untouched food. Rurick did not look away from the storm. Take it back. The servant hesitated. Your Majesty, you have not eaten. I said, take it back. The servant fled. Rurick stood alone with the wind and the nursery and the shape of his own failure. Then he said the names of his sons aloud, quietly, like a vow. And because the palace had no answer, only silence met him back. Far beyond the walls, on the mountain, Lyra woke with Dane chewing her sleeve and Fen pawing her cheek like he had a grievance to settle. She blinked into the gray morning and groaned. If this is about breakfast, she muttered, I'm filing a complaint with fate. Dane sneezed. Fen looked insulted on principle. And somewhere under the mountain's storm-worn skin, the path to the next disaster had already begun to open. The letter had been burning a hole in Lyra's coat for 3 days. Not metaphorically. Dane had actually tried to eat a corner of it on the second morning, and now one edge was slightly damp and curled, which somehow made the treason feel even more insulting. That was evidence, she had told him. He had sneezed and looked away. Fen had said nothing, which meant he agreed with Dane but was too dignified to admit it. 3 days of moving through the mountain, staying off the main paths, keeping the pups close and the letter closer. 3 days of knowing that somewhere below, Rurick's men were still searching. Halvin's people were still moving. And she was the only person on the mountain carrying proof of what had actually happened. That was the part that kept her awake. Not the cold. Not the hunger. The weight of holding something that could destroy a powerful man and save a good one, while having absolutely no way to deliver it without walking into the lion's mouth. I need a plan, she told the pups on the third morning. Fen looked at her with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting for this announcement. Dane sneezed. That is not a plan, she told him. He tilted his head as if to say, neither is standing here talking to us. Fair point. The truth was simple and terrible. She had to go down. Not to Vale. Not to any village that knew her face. But down far enough to find someone who could move the letter without getting killed for it, or at least far enough to understand what Halvin was planning next. Because 3 days of silence from his men meant one of two things. They had given up. Or they had changed tactics. Men like Halvin never gave up. Lyra adjusted her coat, checked the pups, and started down the mountain before she could talk herself out of it. The lower ridge was quieter than she expected. Too quiet, in the way that forests went quiet when something had recently passed through, and the birds had not yet decided the danger was over. Lyra moved slowly, keeping Fen and Dane close at her heels. They were old enough now to walk properly, 7 years having turned 2 tiny pups into long-legged silver-white wolves with gold markings at their muzzles, and the kind of presence that made people look twice. They were also, she reflected, still completely impossible. Dane had already stopped 3 times to investigate things that turned out to be a pine cone, another pine cone, and what appeared to be a highly offensive rock. Fen had stopped once, very briefly, to stare at a beetle with the focused intensity of a scholar presented with a primary source. We are supposed to be moving, Lyra said. Dine picked up the rock. Put that down. He carried it 4 more steps before dropping it with the air of someone making a philosophical statement. Fen did not comment. Lyra kept moving. The first sign of Rurick's camp appeared around the bend of the lower path. Two horses tied at the tree line, a small fire pit still smoking, and the scatter of a professional search party that had stopped long enough to rest, but not long enough to settle. Recent. Very recent. Lyra stopped. Fen stopped beside her. Dine, who had been one step behind, walked into the back of her knee, startled, and then sat down with great dignity, as if that had been his intention all along. She crouched and put a hand on each of them. "Quiet," she murmured. They were. Immediately and completely, in the way they only went quiet when they understood that she meant it. That always tightened her throat. 7 years of moments like this. Two creatures learning her signals, her silences, her fear. Two creatures who had started as her emergency and become her reason. She looked at the horses. She looked at the fire. She looked at the path beyond it, where boot marks pressed deep into the wet earth. And then Fen moved. Not away from her. Toward the camp. 1 step. Then 2. Then he stopped and looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not curiosity. Recognition. Lyra's chest tightened. "You know this place," she said softly. Fen did not answer. But he did not look away either. Dain had gone very still beside her, nose working through the air with the focused precision of someone reading a language Lyra did not speak. Then Dain made a sound. Low. Quiet. Not a growl. Something closer to a name. The hair on Lyra's arms stood up. "Don't," she said, but it came out too soft to be a real warning. Dain sat down in the middle of the path and looked at her. The message was clear. "We are not leaving. You are both going to be the death of me," she told them. Fen sneezed. She found the second camp 10 minutes farther down the ridge. This one was occupied, not by many. 3 men at most from the sound of it. Low voices, the clink of metal, the shift of boots on stone. Lyra kept to the tree line, moving parallel to the path, keeping both pups pressed close to her sides. Then she heard his voice. She had heard it before. Across the ravine, through the storm, low and furious. But this was different. This was quiet, controlled. The voice of a man giving orders he was tired of having to give. "We are not pulling back," Rurick said. A second voice answered. "Sire, Halvin's men were spotted at the eastern pass. If they reach the valley before, then we move faster." Pause. "I am not going back to that palace empty-handed, Torvek. Not again." Lyra pressed her back against a pine and closed her eyes for 1 second. Not again. 2 words that carried 7 years of weight. She had known, intellectually, what the search meant. The desperation, the sleepless nights, the letter in the nursery and the empty cribs. But knowing something and hearing the edge of it in a man's voice were entirely different things. Her chest ached. She did not want it to. Dain nudged her hand. She looked down. He was watching her with gold eyes that were entirely too perceptive for a creature who had once spent 20 minutes investigating a pine cone. "I know," she whispered. He pushed his nose into her palm. Fen stood at her other side, looking toward the camp with the stillness of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Lyra looked at them both. She thought about the letter in her coat. She thought about the arrow in the tree. She thought about Rurick's voice saying "not again," and the way it had hit her somewhere she had spent 7 years keeping guarded. "This is a terrible idea," she told the pups. Neither of them disagreed. She stepped out of the trees. She did not announce herself. She did not have time. Because the moment she cleared the tree line, the younger guard at the fire's edge turned, his hand going immediately to his blade. Lyra raised both hands. "I am not armed," she said. "I mean that. I have a knife, but it's for herbs, and I'm not reaching for it." The guard did not lower his hand. Neither did the one beside him. Fen and Dane moved forward and stood at either side of her, which was either reassuring or considerably more threatening depending on your perspective. "Those are," the younger guard started. "Yes," Lyra said, "they are." Silence. Then boots on stone. Then Rurick stepped around the edge of the fire. And Lyra forgot, briefly and inconveniently, how to breathe. She had seen him across a ravine in the rain, through distance and storm and panic. She had held his cloak. She had read his grief in an abandoned camp and felt his exhaustion in the air. None of that had prepared her for this. He was tall in the way that had nothing to do with height, the kind of presence that made the space around him rearrange itself. His hair was dark and storm-damp. His jaw was set like a man who had been clenching it for days. He wore no crown and no formal armor, only riding clothes worn through with hard travel. His eyes were gray, and they were locked on Fen and Dane with an expression that was not a king's expression at all. It was a father's, raw and devastating and completely unguarded. Lyra watched him see his sons for the first time in 7 years and understood, in the space of 2 breaths, exactly who this man was. Not just a ruler, not just a threat. A person. The kind that grief had worn clean of pretense. Fen moved first. He walked forward slowly, the way he walked toward things he was not sure about, but had decided to trust anyway. His nose worked. His ears were forward. 3 steps, 4, and then he stopped directly in front of Rurick and looked up at him with those impossible gold eyes. Rurick crouched, right there, in the mud, in front of his guards, in front of Lyra, without a single thought for dignity. He put one hand against the side of Fen's face. Fen leaned into it. And Rurick, who had commanded armies and survived treason and spent 7 years refusing to collapse, made a sound so small and broken that Lyra had to look away. Dane, never one to be left out of anything, immediately walked into Rurick's other side and sat on his boot. Rurick let out something that was not quite a laugh, but was the shape of one. His hands moved over both of them, careful and urgent, checking them the way parents checked children they had almost lost. Alive. Whole. Here. Lyra stood very still. She did not know what to do with her hands, or her face, or the feeling that had taken up residence in her chest without permission. Then Rurick looked up, and his eyes found hers. Not the way they had found her across the ravine, through rain and distance and panic. Directly. Close enough that she could see the gray of them, and the exhaustion, and the something else that had arrived without warning in the second he registered her face. "You," he said. Not an accusation. Not a question exactly. Just a word that meant he had been carrying the shape of her for 3 days, and was only now understanding why. Lyra met his gaze and said the only reasonable thing she could think of. "Your sons tried to eat my evidence." Rurick blinked. Dane sneezed. Fen had the grace to look somewhere else. Rurick stared at her for one long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. Just enough. "I see," he said. "The letter is intact," she added. "Mostly. Mostly. One corner is slightly chewed. That was Dane. Fen only considered it." Fen's ear twitched at his name. Rurick looked at her with an expression that was still half grief and half something newer, something that had not been there 7 years ago, because she had not been there 7 years ago. "You know their names," he said. "I named them," Lyra said. Something shifted in his face. Not anger. The opposite of anger. The opposite of anger was considerably more dangerous, and Lyra could feel that clearly, even though she did not want to. "Fen," Rurick said quietly, testing the word. Fen looked up at him. "Dain," he said. Dain's tail moved once. Rurick closed his eyes for just a moment, the way people closed their eyes when something hurt and also healed at the same time. Then he rose to his feet, and when he looked at Lyra again, the king was back in his posture. But the father was still in his eyes. "The letter," he said. Yes. You read it. I did. Then you know what Halvin is planning. I know what he already did, Lyra said. The rest I can guess. Rurick studied her. She did not flinch. She had been banished, survived a storm, crossed a river under arrow fire, and raised 2 wolves who thought evidence was a snack. A king's scrutiny was not going to be the thing that broke her. Something in Rurick seemed to register that. His expression shifted, very slightly, into something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, but lived in the neighborhood of both. You stayed with them, he said. 7 years. They were cold, Lyra said simply. Rurick looked at her. She looked back. Fen sat between them and sneezed. The tension broke just enough to breathe. Dine stood, picked up a stick from near the fire, and presented it to Rurick with the solemn gravity of a creature offering tribute to a newly acknowledged authority. Rurick took the stick without comment. They do that, Lyra said. I noticed. Dine brings things. Fen observes. Between the 2 of them, they have the emotional range of an entire council chamber. Rurick looked at her again, and this time the corner of his mouth moved a little more than before. Come, he said, and turned toward the fire. It was not a royal command. It was the kind of word someone said when they wanted another person near them and were not quite ready to admit why. Lyra followed, because storms rarely gave warnings, and this one had already started. The fire crackled low between them, throwing gold across the cave walls and making everything look softer than it had any right to look. Lyra sat with her back against the stone. Fen curled at her side, and Dane stretched across her boots like he had personally decided the mountain no longer qualified as a threat. Rurick stood a few feet away at first, as though he had not yet decided whether he was a man, a king, or simply someone who had found the shape of his sons in wolf form and was trying not to break apart in front of witnesses. Then Dane opened one eye, saw him still standing, and let out a long sigh so theatrical it should have been illegal. Rurick looked down at him. Dane stared back. Lyra could almost hear the thought passing through the pup's mind. You are tall. That seems inconvenient. A corner of Rurick's mouth twitched. Lyra pretended not to notice. Sit down, she said. His eyes flicked to her. It was ridiculous how quickly that did something to her nerves. You've been standing like that for 10 minutes, she added. Either you're about to deliver a speech, or your knees are worse than mine. I'm fine. Of course you are, Lyra said. Men only say that when they're either lying or moments from collapse. Torvek, who had been lingering near the mouth of the cave with the expression of a man enduring history, made a sound that might have been a cough if it had not been suspiciously close to a laugh. Rurick ignored him. That, Lyra suspected, was a skill he had spent years perfecting. He finally lowered himself onto the opposite side of the fire, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to pretend distance mattered. He sat with the controlled caution of someone who had spent too long commanding rooms that had never once felt as real as this one did. The pups immediately noticed the change. Fen got up, walked in a slow arc around Rurick, sniffed his boots, then his sleeve, then the edge of his knee with the seriousness of a court inspector. Dane, unwilling to be outdone, climbed into Rurick's lap with no warning whatsoever. Rurick froze. Lyra did not. She would later tell herself that she had been prepared for that reaction. She would be lying. Dine settled himself as if he had every right in the world to do so, then pressed his head under Rurick's hand with a tiny sigh. Rurick looked down at him, then at Lyra, then back at Dine. Something in his face cracked, not dramatically, not cleanly, just enough to show the shape of the man underneath the king. Lyra's throat tightened. She looked away first. That annoyed her. It also told her more than she wanted to know. You make that face like you're expecting him to bite, she muttered. He has bitten people. He has bitten my boots. Rurick lifted a brow. Lyra lifted one shoulder. They offended him. Fen, who had apparently decided that the entire conversation was beneath him, sat beside Lyra and leaned his weight against her leg. The movement was small, familiar, intimate in the way only creatures who trusted completely could be intimate. Rurick noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. His gaze moved from Fen to Dain and back again, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. They do that often? Do what? Choose sides. Lyra looked at him for a moment before answering. They don't choose sides, she said. They choose what's safe. Rurick's eyes held hers. Something passed through them then, something raw enough to hurt. He understood exactly what she meant. That was the first time she felt it clearly. He was not looking at the pups the way a king looked at heirs or assets or symbols. He was looking at them like a man who had nearly lost his world and was trying to keep the pieces from slipping through his hands again. It made something warm and dangerous stir low in her chest. She hated that. She did not move away from it. Torvek cleared his throat. I'll be outside, he said, and somehow made it sound like an act of dignity rather than retreat. Good, Rurick said, without looking at him. The general left. The cave settled. Rain tapped faintly against the stone outside. The fire snapped once, then quieted. Fen yawned. Dain, now fully content in Rurick's lap, made a little sound that might have been a hum if he had been human and ridiculous. Lyra watched them both, then looked back at Rurick. He was studying her with the expression of a man who had already lost the right to look away. What? She asked. You named them, he said. Yes. Why? The question was simple. The answer was not. Lyra looked down at Fen, who had one paw tucked neatly over the other, as if he intended to die properly if the moment required it. Then at Dain, who was now trying to nose Rurick's sleeve open, as though there might be hidden food inside his father. Because they needed names, she said quietly, and because no one else was there. Rurick went still. For a moment he said nothing. When he did speak, the words came out rougher than before. I should have been. Lyra looked up. His face had gone very still, but the pain in it was not hidden. He did not seem to know how to hide it. Maybe he had stopped trying. You were fighting for them, she said. I was too late. That is not the same thing. It is to them. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into deep water. Lyra had no answer for that. Because he was right. Because she knew exactly what it meant to arrive after the damage had been done. Because she had spent 7 years pretending she had not needed anyone, and then, without meaning to, become the person who had been needed. Dain shifted in Rurick's lap and sneezed right into his tunic. The silence after that was so absolute, Lyra almost choked on a laugh. Rurick looked down at himself, then at Dain, then at Lyra. Was that deliberate? Dain blinked once, the picture of innocence. Lyra lost it. She laughed first, short and helpless, then had to cover her mouth because the sound came out louder than she meant it to. Fen lifted his head and looked deeply offended that anyone found this moment amusing. Rurick stared at her for one long second. Then, to her complete shock, he laughed too. Not loudly, not fully. But enough. The sound changed the air in the cave. It made the space between them feel less like an old wound and more like the beginning of something dangerous. Lyra looked at him before she could stop herself. Really looked. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with carrying grief too long. There were lines at the corners of his eyes she was certain had not been there 7 years ago. His hands, even now, were careful around Dain. Careful the way hands became when they had once been helpless and were determined not to be so again. He was beautiful in the way a storm was beautiful. Not safe, not gentle, but real. That thought struck her hard enough to make her look away. Rurick noticed. Of course he did. You're thinking something, he said. I'm always thinking something. That wasn't an answer. Lyra picked a piece of moss off her sleeve. It was a warning. His gaze lingered on her for a second too long. Then he said quietly, "You saved them." It should have been simple. It wasn't. Lyra's fingers stilled. "Yes," she said. "You kept them alive." "Yes." 7 years. Her throat tightened. "Yes." Rurick looked at her like he was trying to memorize the answer and the person giving it. No one had ever looked at her like that. Not with gratitude alone, not with suspicion. Something fuller, something that made her feel seen in a way that was almost painful. "You should not have had to," he said. The words were soft. The softness made them worse. Lyra swallowed. They were alone. "So were you," he said. That hit harder than she expected. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw it all at once. The exhaustion, the restraint, the guilt, the fierce and almost desperate love he carried like a second skeleton. He was not a king first. Not in this cave. Not with 2 pups asleep against his knees and a woman across the fire who had done what he had not been able to do. He was a father. A broken one, but not a weak one. That mattered. A lot more than it should have. For a while nobody spoke. Fen had curled against Lyra's side again, eyes half closed. Diane had finally decided Rurick's lap was an acceptable place to nap, and was now breathing with the deep, heavy rhythm of a pup completely at peace. The fire settled lower. Torvek's voice drifted in from outside, speaking to one of the guards in low tones. The rain kept tapping the entrance. Lyra became aware, all at once, that she was still staring at Rurick. He was still staring at her, and neither of them had looked away first. That was absurd. That was also, to her complete lack of amusement, not entirely unpleasant. She cleared her throat. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Looking at me like I'm either a miracle or a problem." He did not answer immediately. Then, very quietly, he said, "What if you are both?" Lyra went still. The words were not flirtation exactly. They were not confession either. They were worse than both, because they sounded true. Her pulse tripped once. Dine woke at that exact moment and promptly sneezed on Rurick again. Lyra nearly buried her face in her hands. Rurick looked down at the pup with the resigned patience. "I think he likes you," she said. "I think he has poor judgment." "Take that back." Dine lifted his head and made a tiny, offended sound. Rurick looked at him, then at her, and something almost soft passed over his face. "I will consider it." Lyra snorted. The moment should have ended there. It didn't. Because Rurick was still looking at her. Because the fire had made his eyes look silver instead of gray. Because she could still feel the shape of his grief and the force of his restraint and the strange, impossible pull that had begun somewhere in the storm and had only grown stronger with every hour since. He said her name. Just once. Lyra. Not title, not suspicion, not gratitude. Her name. It hit her like a hand to the chest. She looked up. His expression had gone still again, but not closed. Never closed. He seemed to be choosing each word as though it mattered more than the last. "I do not know how to thank you," he said. Lyra let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You don't have to." "I know." He did know. That was the worst part. He was not asking for permission to be grateful. He was not trying to buy her loyalty or dress up his guilt in language. He was simply telling the truth. And the truth, coming from him, was dangerous. "I know what I owe you," he said. The words made her uncomfortable. The way he said them made her more uncomfortable. She opened her mouth to deflect him, to make a joke, to say something about evidence and soup and bad taste in wolves. Rurick reached out before she could, not toward her face, not to touch her. Just enough to brush a loose strand of hair away from her mouth when the wind slipped through the cave entrance. It was a small gesture, Barely anything. It should have meant nothing. It did not. Lyra went completely still. So did he. For one suspended second, the fire crackled, the rain tapped the rocks, and the whole mountain seemed to stop breathing with them. Then Dane, because he was clearly determined to destroy all moments of tenderness on principle, opened one eye and yawned directly into the silence. Lyra laughed again, helplessly this time. Rurick's mouth curved, faint but real, and in that instant, with the pups warm between them and the fire turning low, something shifted. Not enough to name, enough to feel, enough to know that the path between them had begun, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Outside, thunder rolled once over the mountain. Inside, Lyra looked at the king who had not slept and saw for the first time, not a crown, just a man. And that was somehow far more dangerous. By the time the rain softened into mist, the cave had warmed enough to feel almost gentle. Almost. Lyra had not moved from her place near the fire. Fen was still curled against her side, one paw draped over her knee with the deep, unashamed trust of a creature who believed safety was a thing a person could make and keep. Diane had chosen Rurick's lap again because apparently the universe enjoyed embarrassing her. Rurick had not complained. That was, in its own way, deeply suspicious. He sat with one hand resting loosely against Dane's back, as though he had been doing it for years instead of hours. The pup slept like he had no shame at all, which was true. Fen, more dignified even in sleep, had one eye half open and was clearly monitoring the situation out of principle. Lyra watched them both and tried not to think about how wrong and right the scene felt at the same time. "You look offended," Rurick said quietly. She blinked. "I'm not offended." "You are. I'm practical." His mouth shifted. That sounded very much like offense. Lyra narrowed her eyes at him, which only made the faintest trace of amusement deepen at the corner of his mouth. That was unfair. He had no right to look like that and still be so tired. Not tired in the lazy sense, not even in the merely sleepless sense. He looked like a man who had spent years carrying grief like armor and had only just begun to realize the weight of it had cut him deep. It made her chest tighten. She had not meant for that to happen. She also had not meant to keep looking at him when she knew he noticed, which he absolutely did. Rurick's gaze slid to hers and stayed there. It should have made her look away. Instead, it made her aware of every small thing. The firelight on his face, the steady rise of his breathing, the careful set of his hand against Dane's back, the fact that, for all his power, he was holding himself with the care of someone trying very hard not to break something fragile. Her. The pups. The moment itself. Lyra exhaled slowly and looked away first. That irritated her more than it should have. "You are doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like you're trying to figure out whether I'm going to insult you or save your life." Rurick considered that. "Can it be both?" She gave him a flat look. "That depends entirely on your next sentence." His eyes held hers for a second longer than necessary. Then, very softly, he said, "You already did save my life." The words landed with more weight than they should have. Lyra opened her mouth to dismiss them. Diane chose that exact moment to sneeze on Rurick's sleeve. She shut her mouth again. Rurick looked down at the pup, then back at her. For one ridiculous second, the entire cave went silent around them except for the fire. Lyra lost the battle with herself and laughed. Quietly, but enough. Dine sneezed again, as if insisting the insult be repeated for fairness. Rurick exhaled through his nose, and this time the laugh that followed was real. Short, low, tired. Beautiful in a way that made Lyra want to look away and not be able to. Fen opened his eyes just enough to confirm that the world was still functioning according to his standards, then yawned and buried his muzzle deeper into Lyra's side. "You're both too comfortable," she muttered to the pups. Dane gave a soft huff and settled further into Rurick's lap like a creature who had reached a decision and refused to be corrected. Rurick glanced down at him with something close to wonder. "You do realize," Lyra said, "that he will now think this is acceptable behavior." "He already thinks that." "Good. So you've learned nothing." His mouth curved faintly. That expression, small, unguarded, rare, hit her harder than she wanted to admit. She had seen him as a voice in the storm, a figure on the far bank, a grieving father in a cave. But this was different. This was him in the quiet. The real him. Not the king that men feared. Not the father bent under loss. Just a man who was trying, with obvious effort, to exist in the same space as her without ruining it by breathing too hard. That should not have been attractive. It was deeply, humiliatingly attractive. Lyra looked down at the fire before her face could give her away. The silence stretched. Not awkward. Not exactly. It was a silence with edges. A silence full of things neither of them had said, because saying them would make them real. Then Rurick spoke. "Did you ever think of leaving?" Lyra looked up. He was still watching her, but not in the heavy way he had earlier. More carefully now, as if the question mattered because the answer would matter too. "Leaving where?" "Here." She considered that. Fenn's paw shifted against her knee. Dine snored softly once, then resumed his very poor sleep posture. Lyra stared into the fire for a while before she answered. "No," she said. "Not really." Rurick did not interrupt. That, too, was suspicious. "I thought about different things," she added. "Safer places, better food, a village with less weather and fewer idiots. But leaving them?" She nodded toward the pups. "No." His face changed. "Not much. Enough." "You stayed for them," he said. "I stayed because they needed me." His gaze sharpened slightly. "That is not the same." "No," she admitted. "It isn't." And that was the truth of it, plain and unadorned. She had stayed because they needed her. Then because she had needed them. Then because somewhere along the way the difference between the two had stopped mattering. She was still thinking about that when Rurick said, very quietly, "You became their home." The words moved through her so cleanly she almost did not know what to do with them. Fenn lifted his head first, as if he had sensed the shift in her breathing. Dane opened one eye. Lyra stared at Rurick. He did not take the words back. He did not soften them either. He simply looked at her with that steady, impossible seriousness and waited. Something in her chest hurt. Not badly. Worse than badly. She looked down at Fenn, then at Dane, then back at Rurick. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she meant. "I suppose I did." Rurick's eyes did not leave her face. The space between them changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. The fire popped softly and sent a thin spark upward. Dane twitched in his sleep. Fenn, clearly deciding enough emotional depth had been tolerated for one evening, got up and walked directly across the blanket between them to poke at Rurick's sleeve with one curious paw. Rurick looked at him. Fenn looked back. Then, with all the solemnity of a tiny royal inspector, he sat down beside the king and leaned against his leg. Lyra laughed under her breath. Rurick's mouth moved again, almost a smile. "You see?" she murmured. "He's chosen his political alignment. I'm beginning to suspect it's you." Obviously. That earned her a look so dry she almost choked on another laugh. Outside, the storm had faded entirely, leaving the cave wrapped in quiet. The world beyond felt washed clean and waiting. Lyra became aware, with increasing annoyance, that Rurick was looking at her again, not like a king. Not like a father under strain. This time it was something quieter, more dangerous. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" looking at me like you've decided something. He did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was low and careful. I have decided several things. Lyra's pulse tripped once. Such as? His gaze dropped briefly to where Fen was now half asleep against his leg and Dane was thoroughly unconscious in his lap. Then back to her. That my sons trust you. She said nothing. That I trust them. Still nothing. That I owe you more than words can cover. Lyra's throat tightened. Rurick's voice did not change, but something in it deepened. And that I want to know you outside of the version of you they already chose. The cave felt smaller, not in a bad way. In the way a place felt when a door had opened that could not be closed again. Lyra held his gaze. She should have made a joke. She should have deflected. Instead, she asked, "And what version is that?" His expression changed with visible care, as if he knew this was a fragile thing and intended not to crush it. The one who can look at a king and call him exhausted to his face, he said. The one who can hold 2 wild pups through a storm. The one who reads treason and still thinks to feed them before herself. Lyra stared at him. Then, because she had no defense for that kind of honesty, she said the first thing that came to mind. You make me sound much nicer than I am. No, he said. I think I'm finally describing you accurately. That should not have made her want to smile. It did. She looked away before he could see it. Dane, traitor that he was, chose that moment to lift his head, yawn directly into the firelight, and then promptly crawl closer to Rurick with the confidence of a creature who had never once feared consequences. Lyra watched him settle there, and could not stop the soft sound that escaped her. Rurick heard it. Of course he did. When she looked up, he was watching her with something warmer than before. Not hunger. Not yet. Something gentler. Something that made her feel like the air had shifted around them. He said, You smile when they misbehave. She lifted a brow. I smile when they survive long enough to misbehave. That got him. A real laugh this time, brief but unmistakable. Lyra went still. It was such a simple thing, so human, so unguarded. And because it was him, because it came from the man who had spent 7 years grieving in silence, it hit harder than it should have. Rurick noticed her expression change. What? She looked at him for a long beat. Then she said quietly, You're not as hard as you want people to think you are. His face went very still. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Then, after a moment, he answered with equal quiet. No. That one word carried more truth than all the grand speeches in the world. Lyra's fingers tightened faintly in the blanket near her knee. She could not stop herself from asking, Do you wish you were? Rurick looked at her for a long time. Firelight moved over his face and made the tiredness there look almost sacred. Yes, he said at last. Some days. Her chest tightened again. Why? He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was with the same careful honesty he had used before. Because it would be easier, he said, to be hard, to be untouchable, to lose and keep moving, to make the world think I am stronger than I feel. Lyra understood that too well. Too well. Rurick's gaze did not leave hers. But I am not, he said. Not when it matters. The fire cracked softly. Fen lifted his head, studied the two of them with sleepy suspicion, then, apparently satisfied that no one had exploded yet, tucked himself back down. Lyra swallowed. The way he said it, the way he trusted her with it, made something in her soften despite her best efforts not to let it. She had spent years being necessary and alone. He was standing across from her, openly admitting he was fragile in the places that mattered. It made him human. It made him dangerous in a different way. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. You do not have to be hard with me. Rurick held her gaze. For one breath, the whole world seemed to narrow to those words. Then he said, "I know." And that was worse, because he did know. Because he was still there anyway. Because he was still looking at her like he had been trying not to look for 7 years, and had finally found something worth the risk. The cave went silent again. Dine, still awake after all the emotional devastation he had clearly not consented to, burrowed deeper into Rurick's lap and made a sound that was almost a grumble, clearly displeased with the lack of attention. Lyra huffed a laugh. Rurick looked down at him with resigned patience. "I think he's jealous," she said. "Of what?" She gestured vaguely between them. "The atmosphere." That earned her a look that was almost amusement. Outside, the last of the rain slid from the stone in slow droplets. The night beyond the cave was dark and clear now. Stars had begun to prick through the sky. Lyra became aware all at once that Rurick had shifted slightly nearer the fire. Closer. Not enough to crowd her. Enough to matter. Her heart did something annoying. He noticed. Of course he did. His eyes moved to hers and stayed there, the fire reflecting silver in the gray. "You should rest," he said. "You say that like I'll listen." "No, I say it like I intend to stay until you do." That should have been an ordinary sentence. It was not. Lyra's breath caught. Rurick saw it. His gaze softened by a degree so subtle it almost hurt. Then, before she could think of a response that did not involve embarrassment or disaster, Dane lifted his head, sneezed once, and promptly rolled over onto Rurick's boots. The moment shattered. Lyra laughed despite herself. Rurick looked down at the pup with what was rapidly becoming expert patience, then back at her. The corner of his mouth lifted. And in that small, quiet exchange, with the fire low and the pups asleep and the mountain holding its breath outside, the distance between them finally stopped feeling like a wall. It started feeling like a door, one that had already opened. Morning arrived softly, as if the mountain had decided to be decent for once. Mist clung to the trees outside the cave. The fire had burned down to coals. Dine was sprawled on his back with one paw over his face like the world had personally exhausted him, and Fen was awake already, sitting upright with the solemn expression of a creature waiting to judge everyone's decisions. Lyra opened one eye, realized Rurick was still there, and immediately regretted waking up at all. He was sitting near the entrance, one elbow on his knee, watching the gray light leak into the cave as though he had not slept either, which, based on the look of him, was entirely possible. "You look terrible," she muttered. His eyes moved to her. "Good morning to you, too. You heard me." "I did. You also look terrible." That earned the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. It was almost a smile, which was unfairly effective on a man who should not have been allowed to look handsome before sunrise. Fen climbed to his feet, stretched, and walked directly across the blanket between them to press his nose into Rurick's hand. Rurick stilled. Then, with visible care, he scratched between the pup's ears. Lyra watched the motion and felt something warm and irritating happen inside her chest. Dine, awoken by the injustice of not being first to receive attention, let out a loud huff and flopped onto Rurick's boot. Rurick looked down at him. Dine looked back. It was impossible not to understand the accusation in that stare. "You are late." Rurick accepted the rebuke with more dignity than Lyra expected. "You're being favored," she told the pup. Dane blinked at her as if that were her fault. Fen sat down beside the fire and looked between them with the air of a veteran observer, which was absurd considering he had once tried to wrestle a puddle. Lyra pushed herself upright and rubbed a hand over her face. "I hate mornings. You hate most things before the second cup of tea. That is because most things deserve it." Rurick actually laughed at that, low and rough, and the sound made her look at him too quickly. He noticed. Of course he did. He was getting far too good at noticing her. The thought should have annoyed her. It did. It also did not stop the strange little pull in her chest. She looked away first and began gathering the blankets with more force than necessary. Rurick stood as she did, then paused when the pups immediately reacted, both turning to him like a pair of tiny guards who had not yet decided whether they were escorting him or being escorted by him. The expression on his face changed. Not much. Enough. He noticed their instinct before she did. "They do that everywhere?" he asked quietly. Lyra glanced at the pups. "Do what?" "Watch me." That made her stop. The truth sat in the cave between them, plain and unavoidable. They did watch him, not with fear, not exactly, with measurement, with a careful, watchful sort of trust that only creatures with hard beginnings developed. They were deciding whether he belonged in their world. Lyra studied him for a moment. He looked back without flinching. No king would have waited for a wolf pup's opinion. This man did. "They know you're theirs," she said, before she could think better of it. Rurick's face went still. Something in his eyes shifted, quick and deep. Lyra immediately wished she had said nothing, or everything, or perhaps both. Dane chose that moment to yawn so hard he nearly fell over, then stumbled toward Lyra and butted his head against her knee. "See?" she said, recovering far too quickly. "He's exhausted from emotional labor." Rurick looked between her and the pup. "Emotional labor?" "He spent the night trying to decide whether to trust you with his dignity." Fen snorted softly. Rurick's mouth shifted again, just enough to be dangerous. Lyra pointed at him. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Look amused. It's unsettling." "You mean unfamiliar?" She narrowed her eyes. He was enjoying this, which was annoying because she was too. The fire snapped. Outside, the morning mist moved slowly over the ridge. Somewhere lower on the mountain, a bird called once and then fell silent again. Rurick's gaze drifted to the tree line beyond the cave mouth. His expression tightened. Lyra noticed at once. "What?" He hesitated. She had learned over the last 7 years that hesitation in a man like Rurick usually meant something serious or dangerous, or both. He said, "There were riders on the lower pass before dawn." Her spine went straight. "Halvin?" "Not his banner." That was worse. Rurick looked at her, and the answer was already there in the set of his mouth. "Then whose?" "Men I do not trust." Lyra folded her arms. "That narrows it down to most of your kingdom." One of his brows lifted. "You're in fine form this morning. I haven't been threatened yet." The look he gave her suggested that was only because the threat had not reached her in person. He was right. That annoyed her more than the weather. Fen trotted to the cave mouth and looked outside. Dane followed, then sat with the gravity of a tiny guard dog waiting for disaster to announce itself properly. Lyra moved beside them, and Rurick came with her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cool air. She hated that she noticed. She hated more that he knew she noticed. "There," he said. Lyra followed his gaze. A distant shape moved between the trees far below. One horse, then another. Not patrol speed, not hunting speed, watching speed. "They're tracking us," she murmured. "Likely. By me?" His jaw tightened. "By all of us." She did not miss the part he did not say. "By the pups, too." That thought made her pulse sharpen. Rurick turned to her then. "We leave before they close the distance." Lyra gave him a flat look. "You say that as if you're the one carrying the supplies." "I have carried supplies." "You have carried a crown, which is not the same thing." That got a real smile out of him, brief and unguarded. It hit her like a hand to the sternum. He saw her react. She wanted to bite someone, preferably fate. They left before the sun cleared the ridge. The path down from the cave was narrow, wet with old rain, and steep enough to make conversation impossible for the first stretch. Lyra moved in front with the pups at her heels. Rurick followed close behind, and every so often she became uncomfortably aware of how near he was without meaning to be. This was not helping her focus. Neither was the fact that Dine kept looking back over his shoulder to make sure Rurick was still there, while Fen had developed the maddening habit of walking just close enough to Rurick's leg to be obvious about it. By mid-morning, they reached a sheltered break in the ridge where the trees thinned and the stone rose in a clean, wind-carved shelf. It was not much of a rest stop, but it was enough to stop and drink, so they did. Lyra crouched beside the stream and filled the skin. Dine immediately tried to bite the water. "No," she said. He bit the air beside it in protest. "Also no." Fen sat beside her and watched, expression calm. Rurick took the skin from her when she stood, and their fingers brushed. It was barely contact, barely anything. Lyra still felt it clear through her hand. She looked up. He had gone still too. The moment lasted just long enough to become dangerous. Then Dane sneezed directly into the stream and ruined it for everyone. Lyra closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said flatly. The pup looked extremely satisfied with himself. Rurick's mouth twitched. He seems determined to prevent suspense. He's a practical creature. She looked at him. "You sound like you agree." "I do." "Traitor." That finally made him laugh again. The sound eased something she had not realized had tightened. Then it hurt. Because laughter was easy. Because this was easy in the way a first thaw was easy, and she knew from experience that thawing could expose things you had spent years keeping buried. She could not afford that. Could she? The thought arrived with unwelcome honesty. Lyra stood before she had to answer it. "We should keep moving." Rurick nodded, but not immediately. "There is something else." That stopped her. He watched her carefully. Torvek found one of Halvin's messengers near the eastern pass. Lyra's stomach tightened. "Alive?" Rurick's expression went cold. "Unfortunately." "Where is he now?" "Contained." "Did he talk?" Rurick looked at her a long second. "Enough to confirm what you already suspected." She did not like the way his tone had gone still. "And?" "And Halvin did not act alone." The mountain seemed to tilt a fraction. Lyra stared at him. Rurick's voice was low now, controlled but not calm. "There is a woman in the palace who has been moving information. Not by force. By choice." "Who?" "I don't know yet." Lyra swore under her breath. "Wonderful. So the traitor is connected to the court." "Yes." "And the messenger said this willingly?" Rurick's gaze sharpened. "No. He said it because he was afraid of her." That made Lyra go quiet. Fear was useful. Fear was honest. But fear of a court woman meant something sharper. Something Halvin had not built alone. The pups, sensing the change in the air, moved closer. Fen pressed against Lyra's leg. Dine sat in front of her, ears forward, watching her face as if he expected her to give him a task. She realized then, with a start, that they were looking to her first, not to Rurick, to her. That should not have made her chest ache quite so hard. "It changes things," she said. "It changes everything." She looked at him. There it was again, the man beneath the king. Tired, furious, controlled only by force of will. The kind of man who would choose the burden rather than spread it. The kind who had spent too long holding a kingdom together while his own life leaked out beneath him. The kind of man she should be keeping at a safer distance. The kind of man she was already too close to. Dane broke the silence by sitting on Lyra's boot and refusing to move. She stared at him. He stared back. "Is this a strategic protest?" she asked. He did not answer, which she took as yes. Rurick watched the exchange with open amusement. Lyra saw it. She saw something else too. How quickly he softened when his sons were calm. How completely the tension left his shoulders when they touched him. how the world seemed to narrow around them whenever they moved closer. It was not weakness. It was love. That kind of love looked dangerous on him. It looked devastating. The thought came out of nowhere and left her unsteady. She turned away before he could read too much of her face. That was a mistake. Because when she turned, she found him already looking at her. Not at the path, not at the pups, at her. It was direct enough to steal her breath for one stupid second. "What?" she snapped, because that was easier than admitting he had caught her off guard. He did not look away. "I was thinking," he said. "That sounds dangerous." "It is." She waited. Rurick's voice lowered. "You have changed my sons." Lyra went still. The wind moved across the ridge, soft and cold. Dane eventually slid off her boot and circled back to Fen. Neither of them made a sound. Her first instinct was to reject the statement. Her second was to demand what he meant. Her third, less convenient than the others, was to feel the weight of it. She had changed them. Of course she had. She had fed them, cleaned them, cursed at them, healed them, laughed at them, shouted at them, and held them through storms. She had become the person they ran to when the world felt too large. The realization should have been simple. Hearing it from him made it feel sacred. She swallowed. "They changed me too," she said. Rurick did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was quiet. "I can see that." She looked at him sharply. He met her stare without flinching. There was no mockery there, no pressure. Just the quiet, steady knowledge of a man who had been watching her more carefully than she wanted to admit. Her pulse moved once, hard. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you can see through me." He held her gaze. "I can see more than you think." That was an incredibly unfair thing to say. Lyra opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of hooves below the ridge cut through the trees before she could. All four of them went still. Rurick's head turned first, then Lyra's. 3 riders moved through the lower pass, cloaks dark, pace measured. Not searching now. Waiting. One of them raised a hand. The others halted. Lyra's stomach dropped. Rurick's voice was low. "That banner." She recognized it a beat later. Not Halvin's colors, the court. One of the riders lifted his head just enough for the sunlight to catch the pale silver edge on his collar. Royal Courier. Lyra looked at Rurick. He was already looking down at the riders with an expression that made his face seem carved from stone. Then, very quietly, he said, "They should not be here." She understood instantly. Something inside the palace had moved again, and this time it had moved toward them. The royal courier did not dismount. That alone told Lyra everything she needed to know. Men came down mountains to deliver messages only when the message was too important to trust to any other mouth. The rider's horse stamped once, impatient in the mud. The man himself sat rigid in the saddle, face pale beneath the travel grime, eyes fixed on Rurick with the miserable determination of someone who had been given terrible instructions and knew it. Rurick did not move. Neither did Lyra. The pups, naturally, were the first to break the silence. Fen stood, ears forward, studying the horse with deep suspicion. Dane gave one sharp bark, then sat down as if he had completed his part in the ceremony, and was now waiting for the rest of the fools to catch up. The courier swallowed. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I was ordered to bring this directly to you." He held out a sealed packet. Rurick took it without a word. The seal was royal, official. But the wax beneath it had been tampered with and resealed poorly, which meant the message had been intercepted before. Lyra saw the flicker in Rurick's eyes as he noticed the same thing. He broke the seal and read, once, twice. Then his face went very still. That was worse than anger. Lyra stepped closer before she could stop herself. "What is it?" Rurick looked up at her. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but there was something under it that made the air feel thinner. "Halvin is at the palace." Lyra's stomach dropped. "He took control of the West Wing after we left," Rurick continued. "He convinced the council I had abandoned the search. He moved several guards. He has named himself protector of the realm in my absence." Torvek swore under his breath from behind them. Fenn's ears flattened. Dane let out a little growl. Lyra stared at Rurick. "That is not a legal title." "No," Rurick said. "It is not." He handed the letter to her. She read faster than she liked. The message was worse than she expected, and somehow exactly what Halvin would do. He had spread the story that the king was emotionally compromised, that the children were likely dead, and that the kingdom needed steady hands, while the throne was vulnerable. He had also named Lyra, not by full name, by description. The mountain woman who had interfered with royal recovery efforts. Lyra snorted once, humorless. "That's what he calls kidnapping and treason?" Rurick's mouth tightened. There was more. Halvin had issued private orders to search party captains and palace staff. If the pups were recovered, they were to be taken from anyone who had sheltered them and returned under Halvin's authority. Lyra's blood went cold. "He planned to use them," she said. "Yes." "To force Rurick's compliance." "Yes." She looked up sharply. "And the woman in the palace?" Rurick's expression changed. "Found." "Who?" He hesitated just long enough to make the answer matter. "Lady Sarah." Lyra blinked. "The healer?" "Yes." The answer unlocked the rest of it. Lyra remembered the line in the letter. One of the king's household healers. She had dismissed it as one more thread in Halvin's web. But now it clicked into place. Sarah had helped cover the nursery access. She had been bribed, threatened, or convinced that the kingdom would be safer if the twins disappeared. Halvin had used her access, then planned to discard her once the work was done. Rurick went on, his jaw hard. She confessed when she realized Halvin intended to accuse her of the theft alone. He promised her protection. Instead, he planned to make her the villain and keep the blame off himself. Lyra exhaled slowly. So he was not just cruel. "No," Rurick said. "He was cowardly." Torvek's face hardened. "The council has been seized by his men in the West Wing, but not all of them support him. Half the guards are waiting for your return." Rurick looked at the courier. "Why now?" The young man swallowed. "Because he knew you'd find the woman." The words cut through the mountain air. Lyra froze. Rurick's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" The courier looked at her once, then back at the king. "Halvin said if you found her, you'd come back immediately." Lyra's pulse stumbled. Rurick went still. The courier took a breath, then added, "He said you would not leave your sons in enemy hands. He said you would return to the palace for them. And for her." Lyra looked up at Rurick. His expression had gone very, very quiet. Not cold. Focused. The kind of focus a man wore when something precious had just been named aloud. She should have looked away. She did not. The courier lowered his eyes. "There is more, Majesty. Speak." "Halvin has the north gate sealed and the lower hall guarded. He has ordered the old nursery wing emptied and locked. He is using the court rumor that the children were taken by a mountain witch." Lyra barked a laugh despite herself. "A mountain witch?" Dane looked personally insulted. Fenn looked ready to bite the courier. Rurick's expression did not change. "Enough," he said. The courier bowed his head. "Yes, Majesty." Rurick handed the letter back to Torvek. Then he looked at Lyra. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. "You do not have to come," he said. The words landed harder than she expected, because he meant them, because he was giving her the choice. Because after everything he had learned about her, after everything she had done, he was still not assuming he owned her place in his life. Lyra looked at him and felt something inside her go very still. "You think I'm leaving now?" His jaw flexed. "I think this is no longer only your fight. It never was." That made him look at her more sharply. She took a step toward him. The pups, sensing the shift, moved with her. Fen pressed against her calf. Dine sat at her boot like a miniature guard with terrible manners. Lyra glanced at them, then back at Rurick. "I stayed because they needed me," she said. "I'm staying now because I need you to stop looking at me like you're waiting for me to vanish." The words hung in the air. Rurick's gaze changed. Not much. Enough. The courier wisely looked toward the horse. Torvek stared very hard at the mountain. Fen sneezed. Diane barked once. Rurick's mouth moved, almost into a smile, then stopped. His eyes stayed on hers. "I was not waiting for you to vanish," he said. "What were you doing then?" He held her gaze for one breath too long. "Trying not to hope." That should not have hit as hard as it did. It did anyway. Lyra felt it all at once. The 7 years of impossible distance, the storm, the grief, the letter, the children, the fact that he had seen her and remembered her, and chosen to hope for her return without saying it aloud. Her chest tightened. She did not trust herself to speak, so she did the only thing that felt safe. She reached down and grabbed Dane by the scruff. He squeaked in outrage. Rurick blinked. Lyra tucked the pup against her side and said, "We're going to the palace." That got everyone moving. They rode before dusk. The mountain path opened slowly into the lower road, and the world changed with it. The wild silence of the ridge gave way to guards, banners, distant walls, and the heavy waiting shape of the palace below. Lyra had not expected the twins to take to travel so well. That had been foolish. Dine spent the first hour trying to climb Rurick's saddle blanket. Fen spent the same hour monitoring the horizon like a creature who had decided he was now responsible for military strategy. At one point, Dane sneezed directly into Rurick's cloak. Rurick looked down at the stain, then at Lyra. She gave him the flattest expression she possessed. "You're welcome," she said. He actually huffed a laugh. The sound made her heart trip. It should not have. It did anyway. By the time they reached the palace gates, the guards there had already shifted into motion. Torvek rode ahead with half the search party, and the West Wing banners had been lowered. Halvin knew they were coming. He was waiting. Lyra felt that in the air before she saw him. The courtyard was too still, too organized. The kind of stillness that meant people had been told to stand and not breathe unless they were commanded to. Men lined the walls. Courtiers watched from the upper gallery, pale-faced and rigid. Then Halvin stepped into view. He was older than Lyra had expected. Not old, but worn in a way that suggested he had spent years smiling at the right people and betraying the wrong ones. His clothes were immaculate. His face was composed. He looked like a man who had never once believed consequences applied to him. Until now. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing to Rurick with just the right amount of respect to make it insulting. "You return with excellent timing." Rurick dismounted. The movement was calm. That frightened Lyra more than if he had drawn steel. "You seized my home," Rurick said. Halvin spread his hands. "I preserved it." "You lied to the council." "I protected the council from panic." "You moved my sons." Halvin's expression did not change. That was when Lyra knew he was the real villain. Not because he grinned, because he did not. He believed himself justified. He believed himself necessary. That made him infinitely more dangerous. "I moved what the kingdom required," Halvin said. Dane made a tiny, furious sound. Halvin's gaze flicked to the pups and then to Lyra. "Ah, the mountain woman. You are more difficult to kill than expected." Lyra's mouth opened. Rurick moved first. Not far. Just enough to place himself between her and Halvin. The gesture was small. It changed everything. Halvin saw it too. For the first time, something in his expression tightened. "So it's true," he said softly. "You brought her here." Rurick's voice dropped. "Say one more word about her." Halvin smiled. It was the wrong smile. A thin, practiced thing. "You are not thinking clearly." Rurick's eyes did not leave him. "I am thinking very clearly." Halvin glanced toward the upper gallery. Several council members had gathered, watching. Waiting. His voice sharpened. "The kingdom has been under strain. The people needed a steady hand. Your grief made you vulnerable. Your search made you absent. I acted to prevent collapse." "No," Rurick said. "You acted to take control." Halvin's gaze turned colder. "And if I did?" The courtyard went very still. Even the twins stopped moving. Fen stood, ears forward. Dine crouched low. Lyra felt the shift in the guards around them and knew this was the moment where history broke open. Halvin lifted one hand. The guards at the palace wall moved. Not toward Rurick, toward the children. Lyra lunged without thinking. Rurick caught her arm. "Stay," he said. She looked at him. "They're going for—" "I know." Then he did something she would remember for the rest of her life. He turned toward the children, raised his voice and said, "No one touches my sons." Not shouted, declared. The words rang through the courtyard and made even Halvin still. The guards hesitated. That hesitation was the crack. Torvek moved. So did the men loyal to Rurick. Weapons were drawn with a sharp, echoing sound. The courtyard erupted. Lyra shoved Dane behind her and dropped low as one of Halvin's guards rushed in. Fen grabbed the man's sleeve in his teeth and pulled, making him drop the blade. Dane lunged at the man's boot, startling him enough to stumble. He shouted, stumbled, and went down in the mud. Lyra grabbed the fallen weapon and turned. Halvin was backing toward the gallery stairs. Coward. Always. He saw her looking and smiled again. That was his mistake. "You ordered the nursery emptied," she said, stepping toward him. "You wrote the message. You framed the healer." Halvin's eyes flicked to her. "You understand politics less than I thought." "I understand monsters." He laughed once. "No, you understand grief. There is a difference." Lyra felt the words hit and knew he had aimed them there on purpose. He was trying to unbalance her. Halvin looked past her to Rurick. "You think she is the answer?" he said. "A banished Omega and 2 pups? You would sacrifice a kingdom for that?" Rurick's face went still in the way that meant ruin. "I would sacrifice you first," he said. Halvin's expression finally cracked. Just a little. Enough. He drew steel. Lyra moved at the same time. The fight was fast and brutal and ended before it could become anything else. Halvin was not a warrior. He was worse, a man who had ordered other people to do his violence for him and had only learned enough to survive the consequences. Rurick disarmed him in a single, swift motion and forced him to the floor. The weapons skidded away. Halvin looked up at the king, breathing hard. Then he laughed. Not from courage, from madness. "You're too late," he spat. "Even if you win, the court has seen your weakness. They have seen you choose her. They will never trust you again." Rurick looked down at him. Then he said, "They already did." Halvin frowned. Rurick's gaze shifted just once toward the gallery. The council members there were not looking at Halvin. They were looking at the children. At the way Fen had planted himself near Lyra's ankle. At the way Dain had climbed into her coat and refused to leave. At the way the king stood between them and the only real threat in the room. Whatever politics Halvin had believed would save him had already failed. The people saw it. Lyra saw it. And Rurick, for the first time in 7 years, looked like a man who had finally chosen the only thing that mattered. He looked at Halvin. "You used my grief to build your throne," he said. "Now you can rot under it." That was the end of Halvin, not with execution, with exposure. The council stripped him of title before sunset. Sarah testified. The messenger confessed under oath. The guards loyal to Halvin surrendered when they saw the court turn. The healer was pardoned. The record of the nursery was corrected, and the twins were formally recognized before the full court as the sons of King Rurick Areth. When the proclamation was read aloud, Diane sneezed in the middle of the ceremony. It drew a laugh from the gallery, then from the courtyard, then, much to Lyra's ongoing humiliation, from Rurick himself. She looked at him. He looked at her, and this time there was no ravine, no storm, no war between the words. Only the quiet certainty that they had survived enough to reach this point and would not be pulled apart easily. That night, the palace slept. Lyra did not. Neither did Rurick. They found each other in the old nursery, now cleaned, the blankets folded, the cribs repaired, but not yet needed. Fen slept curled in one of the small beds. Dane had stolen the moon blanket and was sprawled across it like a victorious little thief. The room was too quiet for how much had happened in it. Rurick stood near the window, hands behind his back, looking out at the city lights below. Lyra watched him for a long moment before speaking. "It's over." He did not turn. "Yes." She waited. When he finally faced her, his expression was tired in the old way and peaceful in a new one. "You kept your promise," he said. She frowned. "I don't remember making one." "You stayed." Lyra swallowed. The air between them had changed again. The fight was gone. The danger had passed. What remained was something quieter, and somehow more frightening. Rurick crossed the room slowly. He stopped when he was close enough that she could feel his warmth. Then he said very softly, "I was afraid to hope, because I thought if I hoped too much, I would lose them again." Lyra's breath caught. Rurick's eyes held hers. "But I have them back," he said. "And I did not lose you." The words were not smooth. They were not polished. They were honest. It was the honesty that broke her. Lyra looked at him for 1 second too long, and then did the only thing she had wanted to do since the cave. She reached for him. Not a grand gesture. Just her hand against his chest, fingers spread over the steady beat beneath his ribs. Rurick went very still. Then his own hand rose, slower, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. His palm settled over hers. The contact was simple. It felt like everything. Lyra looked up at him and saw it there clearly now, impossible to miss. Love, not sudden, not neat, built from grief, trust, respect, fear, and all the small, ridiculous moments the twins had shoved between them like stones in a river until a bridge had finally formed. Rurick's thumb moved once over her knuckles. Lyra let out a shaky breath and gave in. He held her close, as if finally allowing himself to feel what he had been afraid to hope for. It was gentle first, then certain, then a little desperate at the edges. Lyra kissed him back with all the frustration, relief, longing, and disbelief she had been carrying since the mountain. Somewhere behind them, Dane sneezed in his sleep. Fen made an annoyed little sound and rolled over. They broke apart laughing, breathless and stunned, foreheads almost touching. Rurick rested his brow against hers and smiled. Fully this time. Without grief hiding it. Without duty covering it. Just him. "You are smiling," Lyra murmured. "Yes. It's unsettling. I imagine I will survive." "That sounds like a threat." "It is not." She looked at him. "What is it, then?" His gaze softened. "An apology," he said, "for taking so long." The answer pierced straight through her. Lyra laughed once, then blinked hard against the tears she did not want to admit were there. "You're forgiven," she whispered. His eyes closed for one brief moment. Then he pulled her closer, with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally found what he had been searching for. Outside, the city bells rang midnight. Inside the nursery, The future settled into place. Epilogue. The first snow of the year fell over the palace courtyard in quiet silver flakes. Dane barked at one, offended by its arrogance. Fen tried to catch another on his nose and then looked betrayed when it melted. Lyra laughed from the steps. Rurick stood behind her, one hand at her waist, the other reaching down to pluck Dane away from the fountain before he fell in for the third time that morning. The twins were healthy. The palace was peaceful. Halvin had been exiled to the northern border with enough witnesses to make rebellion impossible. He would spend the rest of his life remembered as the man who tried to steal a kingdom and failed because he underestimated a woman with 2 wolves and a king who had finally decided to live. Sarah had returned to her healing work. Torvek had resumed command. The council had changed, and so had Rurick. Not into someone new. Into someone no longer alone. Lyra looked out over the snow and leaned back into his chest. "You know," she said, "I still think they're going to destroy the fountain." Rurick leaned his head close to hers. "Probably." Comforting. He smiled against her temple. "We'll build another one." Dane barked again. Fen sneezed. Lyra laughed. And because the world had already given them enough storms, the snow kept falling gently, as if even the sky had learned to be kind.